Hi everybody, this is Juliana again with a review video for our second midterm exam now. The exam is happening exactly a week from today, so next Thursday, May 26th, during class time. It will have the same format as the first midterm exam, so there are no multiple choice questions, only short and longer essay questions. You do not need to bring a Scantron, you do not need to bring a Blue Book. So the material covered on the second midterm exam is under objectives 2, 3, 4, and 6. So there's nothing under objective 5 on the exam. I will go from objective 2 all the way through objective 6, highlighting what I imagine is the most important things that you need to know based on what Professor Whiteley has said during the class, as well as based on what is on the study guide. So at the very bottom of the page, after objective 6, you're going to see the second midterm study guide, and I will start here to guide me through the questions for objective 2 first. So Objective 2 is mainly about the book Collapse by Jared Diamond. And what you need to remember here is that this book, there are 4 chapters of this book that we have covered. Those are chapters 2 on Easter Island, chapter 5 on the Maya, the chapter 14, which is what we've been calling the Diamond Framework, and then the chapter called Afterword on Anchor. So it says here that you will have a choice on the main second midterm essay question. So you may choose from the first choice, which is where you're asked to share your informed perspective on the 21st century. So basically here you will need to contrast the theories and insights on the fate of civilization as identified by Jared Diamond, Edward Wilson, and Neil Ferguson. It says right there that there are no right answers since this is your informed perspective. Let's see. They obviously emphasize different things. I'm going to go over that in a second. Let me just see what else it says here. Okay, so the first question, as I understand the midterm study guide here, is for you to talk about the fate of the 21st century, so where we're heading, based on the insights that Diamond, Wilson, and Ferguson provided. So let's go back and try to understand each one of those 3 sorts of sets of ideas, which we've been calling frameworks. So first of all, Diamond. I'm going to go back here to the homepage because I think there is a very nice PowerPoint under Weekly Clicker that talks about Diamond's framework. So it would be, I think, well, here, right here. So it's called Diamond Framework. If you go here, you're going to see that it's a summary of chapter 14. Basically, on this chapter of the book, Diamond takes what he learned from the different societies that he investigated. He asked, the question of why they have collapsed. So those are societies that were once very rich or developed or had large populations, and today are either disappeared or have very small population or are poor societies. So he's asking really what happened to them. And when he gets to that chapter 14, he puts together what we are calling a framework with different points that he found in common among all these societies. So, for example, he talks about the fact that the societies in many cases failed to anticipate a problem before it arrived. He explained many reasons why that may happen. For example, it might be an unfamiliar situation so that it's really difficult for us to perceive it because simply we didn't know it existed. So I'm going to move through all the 6 objectives without explaining each one of them in detail, but I wanted to understand that this is important. You need to understand this framework. You need to understand these different points here. So first one being the failure to anticipate a problem before it arrived. Second one, perceiving or failing to perceive a problem that has actually arrived. So sometimes societies already had an issue. They had some decline going on, but they were not able to perceive that. He talks about landscape amnesia, where people forget how things used to be, so that's why they don't see how it has changed. So in this case, change is very gradual, and that's why the problem arrives without us perceiving it. Another point that he makes is that society sometimes fail to attempt to solve a problem even if it has perceived the problem. So why would we do that? Why would we not act if we perceive and agree that there is a problem? Well, he says that sometimes it's rational bad behavior. That is, there is a clash of interests. Sometimes things are framed as long-term versus short-term motives. This is the rationale of it's good for me, it's better for you and everybody else. So those things may lead for us to not act. I think it's especially relevant to the role of politicians. Sometimes recognizing that there is a problem, but not really doing anything about it because of their own political interests or because of their interest in short-term goals rather than long-term goals. So another point that he makes is that those societies that have collapsed had disastrous values. So this is, I think, pretty clear in the case, for instance, of Easter Island, where they were valuing so much the moas that they were willing to basically destroy a lot of their natural resources to be able to build the moas. We see the same thing with the Maya, where they were building temples. They valued that very much. And in that process, they were consuming a lot of resources as well. We obviously see the same thing happening to our society today. Each one of us may think and reflect about what kind of disastrous values do we have that might be destructive to the resources that we need, right? So what kind of values, for example, lead to overconsumption of water or overconsumption of fuel and things like that. Another point that he makes is that sometimes the problem that societies might actually perceive may be beyond the capacity of a society to solve it. So they might not have the financial resources, the technology, the knowledge, the human capacity to deal with this problem. We saw this, I believe, especially with the case of Angkor, where they have a severe drought, and it was really difficult to deal with. There is also the issue of overpopulation, which the Mayan society, for instance, experienced, and we are experiencing today. And how do you deal with that? How do you control population growth? So those things are very difficult to deal with. Climate change being another one of them. It's such a large problem that we're finding it very hard to solve, not only because we don't have the resources, but sometimes we have a lack of political will as well. Then we have the fact that sometimes we try to do something to solve a problem, but efforts may be too little too late. So sometimes the damage is irreversible. For example, with the Easter Island Society, the deforestation led to soil erosion, which is a process that is really difficult to reverse. Actions that we might take to reverse those trends might be not enough. We see this today with climate change. We are trying to reduce in the state of California, I think by 20% or something like that, greenhouse gas emissions in the next decades. But isn't that too little or too late if researchers have shown that the effects of the emissions that we're already having at this point will persist for decades? So this might be another factor in why societies actually collapse. And then we have the problem with solutions that actually backfire and make the problem worse. I think the best example from the societies that we learned was Angkor, where they tried an expensive and vast system of irrigation that actually did not work. So we see that all over again today with our attempts to replace fossil fuel, for example, with nuclear power. That may be a problem that backfire. So those are the points from Diamond that you need to understand, not only to answer that first question on the exam. Let me go back to that. That question that asks you to contrast the different insights, but I believe there is another question where you were asked specifically about how to apply the Diamond framework. Oh, right here, part 2, the Diamond framework for each one of the different societies. So what I just showed you, the PowerPoint under Weekly Clickers called Diamond Framework, is important for you to answer the first question, but it's also important to you if you're asked what from that framework applies to each one of the cases. So that means that you obviously need to know the different cases as well. So those would be Easter Island, Maya, and Angkor. So let me go back here to the first part because we only covered the first choice of question, okay, which would be to compare the insights of Diamond, Wilson, and Ferguson. Actually, we didn't even cover the whole thing. We just talked about Diamond. Wilson, we didn't talk a whole lot about him. There is a couple of PowerPoints, I believe, with slides showing quotes from his work. But I think the essence of his ideas, and if you remember, he's the guy who talked about the fable of the scorpion and the frog. The essence of his idea is that sometimes we collapse, or we are not doing enough, or we are not acting on our problems, and we are being destructive because that's human nature. So I think he's where he looks for the answer is very different than Diamond. So Diamond is looking historically at the roots, the root causes of collapse. Wilson is looking within our own individual human nature. So why we're doing this to ourselves, right? So he talks about humans not being good or evil and being both. So as you can see, it's a very different set of ideas on where the problem lies. And then we have Niall Ferguson, who, if you remember the video, is the guy that talked about the 6 killer apps. Let me go back to the homepage because there are sources for those things if you don't remember them. So if you look here under Objective 2, you do have a study guide for Wilson. Oops, right here. Okay. And then you do have a study guide for Ferguson right here. And I believe you also have the video where Ferguson talks about the 6 killer apps. So right here, okay? So, but the point here was that the Western society is not necessarily in decline, but is being surpassed by the rest of civilization because the rest of the world is now downloading the apps that the West developed. So basically that means the rest of the world is applying or implementing the same sort of social institutions that the West did in the past and upon which the West developed. So his set of ideas, again, are very different. It's mostly, I believe, an economic approach to where the problem lies. So lack of investment in education and technology, infrastructure, things like that. So what you need to get out of this is their different understandings of where we are and where we're heading and why, right? Let me go back to the homepage and to the study guide. So for the first choice of question, you would be able to compare and contrast those different frameworks, okay? For the second choice of question, right here, is asking you to apply the Diamond Framework. So once again, you see why that is important. To, in this case, the problems of Southern California and explain why they developed and what can be done about it. So if you choose to use this second, to answer the second question, okay, I do believe from what's here that you are being, you're going to be asked to choose between two different questions. But if you choose the second question here, then what you're doing is choosing, okay, a couple of problems in Southern California, and then explaining the reasons why we're having this problem and why we're not maybe doing anything about this problem, mostly based on the Diamond Framework. You might also be asked, from what is here, there is a second part to this question, you might be asked what Wilson or Ferguson would say about these problems, okay? So I would strongly advise, because regardless of which choice you make, you need to remember well the essence of the arguments from Diamond, Ferguson, and Wilson. Okay, so as Professor Whiteley says here, there is no right framework, but obviously that the TAs who are going to be grading this are going to look for your informed opinion. So that means you need to show in your answer that you know what the frameworks are. You need to know what their main ideas are, okay? So I already basically talked about the part 2, which is again still about collapse and about Diamond Framework. So I'm not going to go over that once again. Then we have part 3, which is focused on Planet of Slums by Mike Davis. There are, I believe, 2 very important questions here. One is the concept of treason of the state, okay, and how it is a working knowledge, how you can use it to develop a knowledge of in the cases that we studied in class. Okay, I'm gonna repeat that in a second. But the second important question is why is it so difficult to create a healthy environment for children and women in slums? Okay, so let me go back to the homepage and go over those 2 main questions. So objective 3, you have here a study guide for Planet of Slums. I would strongly advise that you take a look at this, but I will cover what I just told you that I think are the main important things, which are first the concept of treason of the state, and then second, women and children in slums. For treason of the state, if you go to the study guide, there is a part of it here, okay, titled the treason of the state, and what it does is it shows 12 quotes from the book that Professor Whiteley selected, and that help you understand what Mike Davis means by treason of the state. Okay, so each one of those quotes is emphasizing a different aspect, but you're gonna get if you read through it, and I encourage you to do, even though Davis's writing style may be a little bit difficult, but the point is that you get the essence of each one of those 12 points. But if you do that, you will see that he's talking basically about what he believes the role of the state is and what the state is actually doing in mostly third world countries, right? So you're going to see here he has a very strong position, which is a critical position of the World Bank and the IMF, and he has a very critical position on what governments are actually doing. As you can see, he talks a lot about the government favoring interests of the middle class and the upper classes, the government neglecting the needs of the poor population, not providing basic resources for the poor. So you're going to see a lot of some are very easy and obvious things here. The poor becoming nomads as slums are completely eradicated. The point here, okay, is that you are able to, as you read those quotes, think about the cases that we saw in class. because the question of the concept of the treason of the state will ask you if each one of the cases we saw in class is or isn't treason of the state. Okay, so the cases are right here. Okay, those, oops, I'm sorry. Those are some of the videos. Okay, we saw those. Mission Impossible is the case of the drug-resistant TB in Pakistan, the Dharavi Islam in India, the Islam warfare in Brazil. We saw the case of the toilets in Kenya. We saw the Skid Row here in LA. We saw the problem of water, access to water in India. We saw the China's Yellow River. So what I would say you probably need to watch those videos again if you don't remember the stories, and try to understand what is happening. So what the problem is, what is the government, and what is the government doing. Okay, and then once you get that, you need to think about whether or not those cases represent treason of the state as it is articulated by Mike Davis. So it's not necessarily your opinion, is this treason of the state or not, but would Mike Davis say this is treason of the state? Now, again, we're looking for an informed answer. So, for example, if you tell me something like, yes, the case in Pakistan of the drug-resistant TB is treason of the state because the government is not doing its job. Well, that's not necessarily a wrong answer, but that's not that this answer is not showing us, those of us who are going to read this and grade this, that you know what the case is about and that you understood the concept of treason of the state. A better answer would be something like, yes, this would be treason of the state because the government has been neglecting. There is a problem, and medication and assistance is being provided privately in a private hospital by private donors. That would be, I think, a more informed answer because it shows us that you understood the case and that you understood what treason of the state is. Okay? So think about that as you look through the other videos and as you read the different 12 quotes under treason of the state. Now, the second question, still related to Objective 3, according to our midterm study guide, is a question on women and children in slums. So why is it difficult to create a healthy environment for them? Here, I think there are many different examples. We saw the children playing on very contaminated water. We saw the lack of sanitation, infrastructure. Sometimes we saw the lack of transportation. Specifically for women, we saw the gender inequality in terms of the availability of restrooms. We saw how that affects women's health. So this is, again, for you to recall these examples and to reflect and think about who is responsible for making decisions in those societies, and how are women and children being affected by those decisions. Okay? There is a video. Let me see if it has been added here. Well, if not, you can probably find online on YouTube if you simply type women and children in slums. I thought it was added here. I'm so sorry. I'm looking through this. It's a video that Narai, the other TA, found. In any case, it shouldn't be a hard question for you, okay? There is also a lot of information on that here on the study guide that has a lot of quotes from the book, some of which are pretty specific on the case of women and children. Okay, just keep that in mind as an important question. There is another question that Professor Whiteley mentioned in class, even though he didn't emphasize, I think, enough. Let me see if I can find it here. But is a question that was asking. Okay, let me see. I'm so sorry. It was a question asking about the relationship between, there it is. How could cities in those countries where economies were contracting by 2 to 5% a year still support annual population growth of 4 to 8%? Professor Whiteley showed this question on a slide during class, and I think it's an important question. Now, the answer to this, you just have to think about it. The economy is contracting, okay? So that means the government has less money, there are less jobs, there are less investment. Now, you still have a population growth. So the economy is contracting, the economy is declining, but you have lots of people being born or migrating to these areas. So how is that? How does that happen? Well, you might want to go back to the book and read page 14 where this question is asked. Actually, Professor Whiteley talks about pages 13 to 19, but I think you can also reflect upon this, right? Isn't that the reason why there are lots of slums? Because the economy is declining and people keep, the population keeps growing. Isn't that the reason why the government is unable to provide infrastructure, employment, education, jobs, so on and so forth? So that might be a question on the exam. I don't know, but if I were you, I would spend a few minutes thinking about this. Okay, so I'm gonna go now back to the study guide, and I'm gonna go now to part 4, which is objective 4, and that was basically on water. So there are two main questions here, I think. One is, why is it so difficult to access clean water in both local and global context? So you might be asked to explain why is it so difficult to access clean water in each of the cases that we looked at, both in the global and local contexts. So if you go back to the home page and you go back to objective 4, you're going to remember all the different cases that we looked at. Some of them very close to home, some of them in different countries. So in each one of them, there was an issue, right? Some of them were infrastructure, some of them were pollution, some of them were lead contamination, some of them were scarcity, so drought. Some of them had to do mostly with overconsumption. Some of them were more related to climate change. So I would advise that you look at those cases again and try to understand how you would answer the question, why is water so difficult to access in each one of those cases. Now, the second question on water would be the question on who owns the rain. And this is specific to the case of the Bolivian water wars, even though it's a question that is being asked all over the place. But as we saw in class, in the case of Cochabamba in Bolivia, the government, not necessarily pressured by, but advised by the World Bank, decided to sell the water rights to private corporations. An American corporation bought the water rights. The idea there was, or the argument of the government, the World Bank, was that the government is unable to provide the infrastructure needed to give people access to water. So they decided to privatize water, so a private company could do a better job at that. Now what happened is that the company raised the water rates by a lot. A lot of people were paying 1/3 of their salaries for water. The population was very upset. There was civil unrest, and the decision of privatizing water was reversed. Now there are two viewpoints here, right? One is the view of the government and the World Bank, basically that water needs to be privatized because it's a scarce resource and we need to put a price on it so that people don't waste it. Another viewpoint is what the population in Cochabamba was arguing, is that water falls from the sky and it's a renewable resource and it's a human right, so no one should be able to own it, right? It should be shared amongst the population. So you might need to remember those different points of views and the arguments and who is making those arguments, because that's the essence of the question, who owns the rain. Now I'm going to go back to study guide, and we're getting there. We're getting now to objective to the last part of it, so part 6, because as I said, there are no questions on part 5. So part 6 is what we started this week, environmental surprise. So the title of it says, what do you need to know? You need to know what environmental surprise is and how it applies to Pam, Katrina, Sandy, and Haiyan. I'm going to go back to the home page and back to the objectives. So objective 6, the first link here. Oh, jeez, I hate that. First link, environmental surprise. This is what the definition consists of, okay? Environmental surprise has 3 elements. So I would advise that you take a look at those. Discontinuity, very easy, I think, to remember, but discontinuity is an abrupt shift in a trend, right? Something that is different than usual. It's not a gradual decline. So the time scale matters, right? It's something fast. It's something abrupt. Synergism is the idea that several things together produce an effect that is greater than each one of those things separately. And then a noticed trend is the idea that changes might go unnoticed because sometimes they're too gradual, so they're slowly happening and we don't really notice their trend, or simply because the change is not familiar, so we don't have knowledge of what is really happening in order to understand the trend. So the second part there of the title is application of this definition to the cases of Pam, Katrina, Sandy, and Haiyan. So you need to remember, obviously, what the stories were. So Pam was a simulation, right? It was not a real hurricane. It was simulation that was created a year before Katrina. So in 2004, the idea was to educate those involved in emergency response and planning in case of a hurricane. So it was to educate them on what kind of effects a Hurricane 3 would have. And some officials that participated seemed to take it seriously. Others did not seem to take the information very seriously. A year later, you have Hurricane Katrina. So that was a Hurricane 5. So, for example, that could be seen as a discontinuity, right? That region does not usually get Hurricane 5, Hurricane level 5. That's why they were being trained, and a lot of the protection, the levees, for example, were built to withstand Category 3. So maybe that could be considered discontinuity, right? Then with Katrina, you saw a lot of destruction. A lot of it applies to the idea of synergism. So you have so many things that actually went wrong. You had loss of wetland, which used to be a natural protection. You had the geographic shape of the city in a format of a bowl that, it was pretty easy for water to get in and very hard for it to be pumped out. You had the fact that you had warmer waters in the Gulf, and that's why the hurricane was actually a Hurricane 5, because it got more energy as it crossed the Gulf. You had problem with evacuation. Lots of people didn't want to evacuate because they had evacuated a year earlier for a hurricane that didn't arrive. So all these put together actually created an effect that was devastating and probably greater than each one of those factors taken separately. So that's an example of synergism. I think a lot of the things that relate to Katrina and then later with Sandy we saw have to do with unnoticed trends. So, for example, the fact that the ocean is warmer, and scientists are starting to see a relationship between climate change and more frequent and devastating disasters, environmental disasters. So, because waters are warmer and hurricanes feed off of warm waters. So, Sandy had that aspect. It also had synergism, and it had a lot of discontinuity. For example, if you remember, it took a left turn when it hit New York. The usual trend would be for hurricanes to go east and die off, and this one went west. that had to do with a lot of unusual circumstances, like the jet stream making a turn instead of pushing the hurricane to the east, the waters obviously being warmer, different pressures, and also if you think about synergism, you had another storm, superstorm, joining it. So you had two superstorms combined. So I hope that what I'm saying here gives you an idea of what you might need to understand for the exam, which is how each one of those cases, Pam, Katrina, Sandy, present or don't present the elements of environmental surprise, discontinuity, synergism, and a noticed trend. Okay, I think that maybe the only other thing important here might be the relationship between climate change and environmental disasters. We saw today in class, so I'm just going to show you what that clicker is so that you can read it by yourself. I'm going to Weekly Clicker, and if you go to Hurricane Sandy, there is some discussion there about, you know what, it doesn't let me open, but if you go to Hurricane Sandy and you look at the slides, there is at least one slide that talks about the relationship between climate change and environmental surprise. You might want to take a look at that again. Okay, so this is all that we have covered so far. At the end of class today, Professor Whiteley started to show videos about the economic crisis here in the United States in 2007, the housing crisis. You're going to see more of that next week. I do not know if there is any question on that. It's not on the midterm exam. So I would just advise you to try to understand this story, because if you're asked a question, it's probably going to be a broad question and not a question on the details of what happened, but questions on the role of the government and the causes of the crisis and things like that. I do not think it's going to be on the exam, but you might want to think about that. Okay? Well, I think that's all I have. There are no questions again on Objective 5. There are no questions on Jessica Buchanan. We saw the video about her rescue. There are no questions on the exam about that. That was simply to inspire you and to show you that people do try to help, do work. Sometimes it doesn't go as planned. And yeah, I think that's all. If you have any questions, you can always send me an email or ask Professor Whiteley or one of the TAs. And good luck next week.